let me introduce James very quickly. You've read the blurb, and so you have some sense of his varied background. He's been doing something which I think is particularly interesting and apposite at this particular moment in time, which is to try and synthesize, if you like, what's known scientifically about what's going on in the brain, with something that usually doesn't concern people who are neuroscientists, which is the depths of extraordinary human experiences. And if one has actually had one of these, and many people I know in this room in one way or another have, that produces a deep problem of integration. How does one make sense of things in order to get a meaningful, integrated world view? So that's what James has been working on for a while, and he's produced a book called The Dawn of Mind. I've managed to read quite a lot of it. I haven't quite finished it. I will do, because I've been simply dealing with too many things. But it's particularly clear and well argued. And so it's a pleasure to introduce him, to tell you something about himself and also about his book. So James Cooke.
Yeah, thank you, Max. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, and thank you all for coming. This is, I feel this is the perfect audience for me, so I'm very excited to be talking with you today. Oh. Yeah, how? Is it okay now? I'll try and talk slowly and loudly. Is that okay? Give me thumbs up and thumbs down, you know, wave if I'm unintelligible. So my path that leads me to being here today really began when I was in my early teens. So I was raised Catholic, and I was an overly conscientious kid. And so when I was told that I would go to hell for not having blind faith, I took that very seriously and thought that was something I really needed to figure out. So I was about 13 years old. I didn't have blind faith. I was already kind of scientifically inclined, kind of rational skeptic type person. But I was intimidated by this prospect of hell. So I really wanted to have blind faith, but I couldn't find it within me, and I couldn't, you know, by definition, I couldn't use evidence. I couldn't find evidence to sum it up. And so one day I was on a bus ride in Colchester, where I was living, and I was stuck in this rumination that was along the lines of, this creator God has made me without blind faith, yet he demands that I have it, and he's supposedly benevolent, but he's going to torture me for infinity for not having it, but he's made me this way, and I can't have it, like, but he needs me. You can't hear me? Oh, really? Let me lift it up higher. So I was stuck in this rumination about not having blind faith, needing to have it, couldn't have it. This God had supposedly made me this way, but was going to torture me for not having it. So I was stuck in this loop, stuck in the thought space, really experientially, trying to find a way out through reason, through thinking, through thought. And in retrospect, I now think what happened was something like what happens in Zen Buddhism when someone practices with a koan, a question for the mind to kind of chew on that can't be solved rationally until the mind kind of hits a dead end and then relaxes. And so I just hit this stopping point after this like deep emotional investment in needing to figure out this existential question. And then suddenly in an instant, the thoughts just vanished. And then in that moment, there was I found myself, but I didn't find myself. There was an entire kind of absence of self, and it seemed really obvious in that instant that existence is unitive, whole, unbounded, free. This luminous appearance here and now in which there are no problems. Unless you start believing in the reality of what you're thinking about, there are no problems. Experience is inherently free and open and at peace. And from that day on, the concerns evaporated. And when I returned to this thought months later, I was like, oh, I never solved that blind faith thing. Let me think about that again. And from that perspective, it was, oh, well, that's just a series of ideas that people have told me. They don't seem useful ideas. They're causing me suffering, so I'll just leave those aside. It seemed really obvious after that shift. But before then, I didn't have that kind of spaciousness of awareness to see ideas as ideas. I was kind of seeing through them. So I came to learn that this kind of experience is called awakening in Buddhism, or Kensho in Zen Buddhism, and there are different terms for these kinds of experiences. But it was I think scientifically minded, skeptical people, when they hear about these experiences, they often think that what's happening is often they'll dismiss it as a delusion or as some departure from reality to something less real, something, different. Whereas this felt like a deep state of insight into the way reality really is, that the deluded way of being was to be stuck in the thought space, not having space around my thoughts, not seeing thoughts as thoughts, but instead being bound by them. And it also does a lot of suffering. So when I was in that thought space, so this unbound consciousness experience really was the solution to my suffering. And the sense of it being connected with the real, with connecting with what's most real in existence, left me with a sense, well, if science is studying reality and contemplative practices allow us to study reality, perhaps these are two windows onto the same thing. And if so, they should cohere, they should match up. So I still had my aversion to dogmatism from the kind of Catholic upbringing, so I became a scientist, and I decided if this stuff is real, it should be testable, provable, explorable with science. So that led to me becoming a neuroscientist, and spent 7 years at Oxford getting my PhD and other degrees, and then practiced for over a decade. And in that time, I came to develop a theory of how consciousness, or how it is it relates to what we call the material world. I won't make any claims at this point about what that is, but there seems to be this experience that we're having. There seems to be some, when I say consciousness, I don't mean self-awareness or thinking or cognition. I mean just the simple experience of anything, the feeling of pain, the blue of the sky. We're all having these experiences, but there seems to be this thing we call the objective or the material. There's something in between our experiences. Like if we all measure this table, we'll all probably come up with the same number. So what is that number? That number seems to be something that's not the same thing as all of our individual experiences. So I'm gesturing there to what we call matter, what we call the objective world, the bits of reality studied by science, the third person perspective. So in this book, to kind of unpack the solution I'm offering to this mystery of how these two things match up, which is known as the hard problem of consciousness, or just the gap between matter and mind. To do that, I both offer a worldview, a kind of philosophical perspective, which I call Nondual Naturalism, which is a synthesis of science and spirituality. So non-dual refers to the non-separation, sense that reality isn't divided up, it is whole, unitive. And naturalism is just a commitment to having our stories about the world cohere. So if I think, looking at things under microscopes and doing science is valid, and I think meditation and insight there is valid, I should expect it all to kind of to match up. If my stories about meditation have certain predictions about what happens in the brain and they turn out to be wrong through science, I think we should then wrestle with those issues and not just dismiss them and just go on one side or the other. So that's the perspective I bring as a kind of contemplative and a neuroscientist. So to begin with, I'll go into this philosophical worldview, and then we can talk more about the details of the scientific picture. It would probably be good as well to have, if you have any questions or to make this kind of interactive. I might pause here actually before we go into the philosophical picture in case anyone has anything they want to clarify or if anything was unclear in what I've said so far. Yeah.
Just go back to the beginning when you were wrestling with the thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
What was exactly that thought which is being discussed?
I can repeat the question if that helps. So it was just to repeat the kind of riddle I was wrestling with that led to this awakening. And it was that I was raised Catholic, and I was told that if I didn't have blind faith, then I would go to hell, and I didn't have blind faith. And I couldn't find evidence for the God I was told, this kind of authoritarian version of a God that was going to punish me. And so I couldn't find evidence for this God, and I couldn't find this blind faith within me. And so the kind of loop was, I don't have blind faith, this God's made me without blind faith, he's supposedly benevolent, but he's going to torture me forever for not having blind faith, but I can't find it, and he's made me this way, and I can't get it, and so I just went around and around until I made it sound really simple. It's easy as that, then you wake up. So yeah, so to get onto the philosophical, the worldview, the nondual naturalism, the way most scientists who aren't trained in kind of contemplative traditions approach the mind is, without realizing it, there's a lot of kind of common sense intuitions about how reality is and how the mind is that they bring to bear. And unless you start to kind of examine delusion and understand the mind, your thinking is going to be kind of imbued with those assumptions. So I think there are three in particular that are quite insidious that plague the field of consciousness science, and just the way that a mistake we make about reality. And that's that we think certain things are objectively real and true that actually are mental constructs, mental fabrications. And three particularly important ones are self, substance, and separation. So we think that we are a self, an actually existing entity, or many people have this intuition that they are some kind of being that inhabits the body, maybe in the head, that looks out from the eyes onto the world. And we typically feel we're not fully identical to our bodies. People can talk about what will happen to me after my body dies. That kind of intuitively makes sense to a lot of people, that question, which points to the idea that you are something different to the body. People talk about, could you upload your mind into a machine and live forever? And so, again, surviving the death of the body. So that self, that thing that we think we are, many people feel is an actually existing thing. But the suggestion here is that it's actually a construct, a fabrication, an experience that arises in consciousness, a kind of avatar, like a character in a video game, that isn't actually in the video game example, there's just pixels on a screen. Here, there's just experiences and awareness. There is no central thing in here that is the self. And so this very much fits with Buddhism. Separation is connected with that in that the fundamental stance of the self is to feel separate. What is the self and what is the world is the fundamental duality. And that's what non-duality negates, that duality between the idea that you are a genuinely separate thing, but also that anything is really separate. The idea that we live in a world that's just made of lots of different objects, like a pile of junk that just is floating around in space. The suggestion is that actually the world is this interwoven, everything in existence is a single unitive interwoven whole. And object perception allows us to pick out patterns and perceive things as being genuinely separate. But I think that in reality, nothing is truly objectively separate. Everything is connected. And then substance is, we have this experience that this table is solid. It feels like a solid material thing. And I'm not falling through the ground right now. So it feels like we have this kind of common sense intuition that that's because things are made of some material solid substance. Or a lot of, maybe people in this room don't, but the average person, a lot of people have that impression. And then with these kinds of states of consciousness, these mystical experiences, you can discover that experience of solidity is always an experience. It's a relationship between me and the table, me and the floor. And you may, if you've studied any physics, you may know that my atoms are almost entirely empty space, the floor is almost entirely empty space. And the reason we don't pass through each other is to do with the forces and it's a relational thing. It's not to do with them actually being made of something, a substance, something that has an actual kind of independent existence. And so this also fits with our best kind of most mainstream thinking in physics, where a few years ago, some scientists won the Nobel Prize for just proving that subatomic particles are not locally real. So that means that they don't have inherent properties before they're observed. They're not just sitting there. If something is made of a substance is something that just exists for itself, that could just be there. But it seems that the fabric of reality isn't like that. And we have this, if you have a sand castle, you can understand that the substance it's made of is sand, and there's a relationship between the sand and the castle, or the same with Lego bricks and a Lego castle. And that makes sense for us as these evolved primates to have this way of experiencing. But I think there's no reason to think that generalizes to the very fabric of reality. To think that, this is the idea of atoms. At the bottom there are just these little bricks, and that's it. Reality is just a little pile of bricks that's kind of built up. So I think reality isn't like that. It's insubstantial. This also fits with many spiritual traditions, particularly kind of Taoism. Too many to name, but I think Taoism in particular I find a lot of resonance with. So in those traditions, in the Tao Te Ching, it points to the Tao being both the creative principle of existence, but also everything in existence. There is no difference between the creator and the created. But its potency is through its emptiness. So it points to examples of the emptiness of a bellows being what allows it to make wind and then fuel or fire, or the emptiness of a cup being the thing that allows it to be filled. And so I think a view of reality in which there is some profound, open, potent, void-like principle that's this generative, creative prime mover. And then we are the creation happening within that. Again, no separation between creator and created. To me, that actually fits a lot better with what we know from science. And so at this point, we are talking about metaphysics. And as a scientist, I can't prove this. This is speculative. I'm telling you a story at this point that I find useful. So you're under no obligation to feel I've proven anything or made a good argument. This is kind of, if it resonates, then good. But I think everything starts to line up if you entertain this possibility that reality is insubstantial. And now when I say insubstantial, the common move is to go from this reassuring feeling of, okay, reality is made of a solid material substance. I know what matter is. I'm on some solid ground. And then you have these experiences and you go, oh, actually, that doesn't seem to be the case. I've never seen matter. It always shows up through my experience. Maybe reality is this process. Actually, I should mention that's the philosophical term for this perspective, is a process-relational picture of reality, which is, reality is more like a river than a solid object. It's a flowing stream of occurrences, happenings. It's this great kind of dance, this great happening, rather than a solid object. That's the process part. And then the relational part is that any of these individual happenings they only are what they are because of their relationship to everything else. So interconnectivity, relationality, the web of existence, Indra's net, this principle of interconnection is absolutely fundamental. So it's common for many people, once they lose that solid foundation of the material in their experience, to then the pendulum can swing to the other extreme and say, okay, well, maybe consciousness, maybe mind is like some kind of fundamental ground, some solid substance that is the basis of all of existence. And I think that's a swing too much in the other direction, and it's also still a way of having some idea of a ground, some solid substance. And I think it blocks the kind of, what to me makes more sense is this groundless, empty, insubstantial, flowing picture of reality. There are debates between different schools in Hinduism versus Buddhism that have explored this for millennia, and we can talk about that. But so that's the kind of the broad strokes of the philosophical perspective, the worldview that I'm laying out. And before we go into the more kind of technical sciencey side of things, maybe it'd be good to check in and see if there are any questions or reflections on that perspective.
Sorry if I missed this, if you've already told us, but are you a Buddhist or a Taoist? Do you practice those philosophies?
Yeah, I didn't mention anything about that. Yeah, so I don't have any identity around being in a particular lineage or tradition. I mean, I'm not in a lineage or a tradition. I've practiced Vipassana, Zen, a few different Buddhist things. I found influence in many things from kind of Gnosticism to Sufism so I've explored lots of different traditions. So I guess I'm something of a kind of perennialist in that sense of thinking that there's some truth at the core of all of these traditions. And yeah, so I'm something of I guess like a kind of my secular scientific kind of orientation as a person is very much there, where I'm trying to truth to me is beyond anything you can say about it. It's beyond language. And so all of these are maps. They're fingers pointing to the moon. They're different maps onto the same thing. So I don't commit myself to say I am a Buddhist or I am but I would say I've just found myself gravitating to strains of Buddhism as being very aligned with what seems to make sense to me. Particularly Mahayana Buddhism, Zen, Tibetan Buddhism. But that's not to negate the other traditions. I think they've got a lot to offer. But I just find the philosophy there really, there's a lot of rigor and a lot of really good stuff that I think makes a lot of sense. But no, I'm not. I don't identify as a Buddhist. Thanks. I think that also comes from my phobia of dogmatism, because I had this orientation towards trying to figure out reality, and I was given a list of things I had to believe or else, and that was the way I was introduced to religion, spirituality, whatever you want to call it. And so I think that's just a personal quirk of mine, is that for me, that's not who anything where I'm like, well, I'm here today because I'm a Buddhist and I want to convert you all to Buddhism, and you need to believe the things in the religion, like that's the opposite of my orientation. And so my instinct to write books like this is to kind of show my working out and say, yeah, there's something here in our understanding of reality that can be pointed to by anyone, no matter your background. It's available to everyone because it's immanent, it's right here in our experience. So it transcends all those traditions. Any other questions? Yeah.
Something to do with the ideas of boundaries in terms of substance and space. What about boundaries in terms of time? Something to do with notions of infinity or in something like that. If you could kind of just touch on that.
That's a great question, yeah. So I could have emphasized in the awakening a really core aspect of it is that there was a sense before that the future and the past are very much real, and I'm on this timeline, and it's this linear thing where, tomorrow really does exist in some sense, and I'm really going towards it. And then with the awakening, what seemed obvious, and still seems obvious, is that what exists is a kind of timeless flux now. It's always now, and it's eternal in that sense, totally unbounded, and you can't locate it on some line. And what the mind can do is create this mental dimension of time, and then plot the change over that. So it gives some very convincing impression that, no, I really live on a timeline. But the timeline is always something you're putting into play, always a fabrication. So it's a bit like if you had a dot moving up and down, and that's what existed. And then suddenly, a scientist comes along and says, okay, well, I'm going to track this over time on an axis, on like a line. And then the dot, what you would get is a sine wave, just a wiggly line going up and down. And so if that dot is what exists, if you were to say, does the sine wave exist? Does that wiggly line there exist? That's an interesting question, because it's latently there, it's implicitly there, but you have to put that line in play to start to entertain this whole world of, so that's the kind of world we live in. Time is one of the most fundamental dimensions, but we spin out from this instantaneous moment of just the energy of existence really fluxing now. We spin out this whole multidimensional world of oh no, I'm James and I have my life and I'm going here, and it takes on all of those are mental ideas, some of which are can be predictive. So you can end up intercepting the line if your job is to try and predict what's going to happen, which actually sets me up for the next thing, because that is what the brain does. So I'm not negating that in some sense tomorrow does exist in a latent way, like the sine wave exists in that line, but it doesn't really exist. It's not actual. It only exists in our minds because we all have this shared way of kind of conjuring this reality that isn't here right now. So this is how we think about in neuroscience, how we think about consciousness, which is that it's a controlled hallucination is a term that's used a lot. So this room right now, the common way most people come to adulthood who haven't had these kind of extraordinary experiences with a sense that the world is as it appears. The blue of the sky just is there. This table is as it appears. And I'm in here in my head. And my consciousness is almost barely there. It's just some light or some window that allows me to see the world. It's a very simple relationship. And that's called naive realism in philosophy. And if you start to investigate that, I think pretty much everyone comes to realize that can't be what's going on. Just the fact that illusions are a thing shows that what we experience isn't the same thing as what's really out there in the world. There was this dress that was all over the internet a few years ago because some people saw this picture of a dress as white and gold, and other people saw it as black and blue. People couldn't believe that a lot of people thought the other people were lying to them and just trying to mess with them. But it's because we're all carrying around this simulation of a world, this kind of conjured up hallucination, but it is controlled. So You know, when you go to bed at night, you can dream whole worlds, right? And those are hallucinated, conjured up. They're not really happening in the way that, you know, I'm here with you now in this room. And the idea is that when you wake up into daily life, the brain's still doing exactly the same kind of thing. It's still conjuring a world, but the difference is you're there giving me like feedback through light reflecting off of your bodies and off objects in the room. And so my brain can fine-tune the hallucination so it's not entirely unconstrained. I don't start, you know, seeing pink elephants or whatever, you know, unless I've ingested something. So otherwise, you know, you're coupled to what's going on in the world, but it is this simulation, this conjuring, this hallucination. And this fits with the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, who he's credited with what's been called a kind of Copernican revolution with the mind. So in the same way Copernicus updated our view of the Earth being at the center of the solar system to the sun being at the center, Kant had this, was basically articulating what I'm articulating now, which is that we're not experiencing the world directly, we're experiencing what he called the phenomenal world, the world of consciousness, the world of experience. And then he posited a noumenal world, a world in and of itself, which is beyond the appearances. So if you think of the sun, it looks away to us with our primate, human, mammalian perceptual systems. But if you took a python into space and you showed it the sun up close, they have infrared vision, and so they would see all this extra light that we don't see coming off the sun, and it would look very different to the snake. Now, you can ask, is the snake right, or are we right? Like, what's the correct answer to what the sun looks like? And the answer is, there isn't a correct answer. There are appearances that occur in our minds, and the sun itself is free from inherent appearance. It's energy. It's just, you can't know what it doesn't look like anything in and of itself. So the controlled hallucination perspective is really in that lineage of Kant. And this is really becoming kind of mechanistic now in how we think about, it's being unpacked at that level of what's going on in the brain, at the kind of mechanistic level. So with the naive realist view, where I think the world just is as it looks, I'm seeing it directly, a corresponding way of thinking about the brain that I was taught as an undergrad is that, well, the table's there, light comes into my eye's like a camera, then it sends information to my brain, which is like a computer, and then that analyzes it, and it sends signals to my muscles, which are like motors. And so in a very kind of engineering, linear, step-by-step way, you have this view of the brain that's just very like, okay, do this task, done, move on to the next task, and yeah, it all gets completed in this linear way. We're starting to see over the last few decades that doesn't seem to be how the brain works. That's an outside-in view. You start with the table and you move forward into the brain. But what we've replaced it with now is an inside-out view, which is called the predictive processing perspective. And the idea is that it's vastly more efficient for my brain to make an educated guess about what's going on in the world and only use resources if it's wrong. Because if you're good at making guesses, you can save a lot of energy that way. So if you think about, if you have a white background and a black piece of paper on it, and you had a camera that had to send that information, the simplest way you could do that is every pixel, you send a bit of information. So you say, okay, white, 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 black, 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 black. That's very redundant. There's actually no need to send that much information, and all the information you're sending is using up energy. So what you could do instead is signal once for the first white, don't signal anything until it changes again to black, and then you're done. And so you've only signaled 2 bits of information versus potentially thousands, millions. If you scale, you make the pixels finer and finer or the paper bigger and bigger, and in the first example, you suddenly get this huge increase in how much energy, how much information you have to process and how much energy you have to use. And in all those cases, no matter how much resolution you get, you still only have to send 2 bits of information in the second example. So it's an incredibly powerful strategy. And so it seems to be one that evolution has used again and again, because that's what evolution does. It kind of filters out the things that are best at surviving, saving their energy. And that's an example over space, but the same thing happens over time, where if you're seeing someone kind of jumping up and down, and you have some model in your head of that motion, there's no need to, again, like have your brain take a snapshot every instant, every millisecond, and send that information to the brain. It can, if the background's staying the same, right now, there's no need to be sending the same information again and again about the stained glass window. It's unlikely to change as well. And you have some model of like how my body's going to be moving. If I do suddenly jump to the side, then your brain can say, oh, error, I'll now allocate resources to update my model. This is the controlled part of the controlled hallucination. But otherwise, yeah, that's the way we go, is just sticking with our guesses, our educated guesses. So we're starting to get towards a place for consciousness in the operation of the brain here, because with the naive realist view, you might think that consciousness is about knowing, that like that glass is as it seems, and the job of my consciousness is to know what that glass looks like. But with the Kantian view, you start to see that actually consciousness is more like believing. It's more like coming up with a guess, an idea, a hypothesis about how the world is. You know, to me, the sun, I think it looks a certain way. The snake thinks it looks a different way. So if you start to think about the contents of consciousness in that way, then you can see in this view that that initial guessing about how the world is, I think that is what gives rise to the contents of consciousness. Now, if you're dealing with that in terms of brains, you get into a lot of philosophical problems, to do with reductionism. We can talk about that later if people want to. But I think those are solved if you get over the cultural bias we have around trying to convince ourselves that humans are the be-all and end-all, that we're somehow separate, better than the rest of the natural world. And I think that's a kind of a mistake that's happened over the last few hundred years in philosophy, but also runs a lot more deeper with, I think, the origins of agriculture. And yeah, it's there in the Old Testament about that, you know, God gave the creatures of the earth basically for humans to use. They're instrumental things for us to use, you know. So I think there's a kind of more animist view where we see ourselves as kin with other living things. I think it's closer to the truth. And I think it matches with the science. And the case I'm making is that I don't think experience, consciousness, came into existence with brains. I think it came into existence with life. That the first life form had to feel its way out in the world. And it turns out that fits with the physics that we now know about this predictive processing stuff. So that was first understood with regards to the brain. And then it was basically discovered that the reason the brain does that is because the brain is a servant of the life process, which is, perhaps that should feel obvious, but the way neuroscientists often think about the brain is as some really special supercomputer that's like better than the rest of the body. You know, the liver's just doing whatever, and the lungs are just helping us survive, and the heart's just helping us survive. But to me, it seems obvious, you know, the brain is also there to help us survive. But somehow neuroscientists have this, yeah, I think it's this desire to kind of puff ourselves up and convince ourselves that our brains are something other than servants to the life process. So I advocate for a view in which experience arises not because we have brains. In us, they are involved in the loop of how we sense and engage with the world, but it is that sensing and engaging as an embodied organism that gives rise to consciousness. So I don't think you need a brain. I think all living things experience. Anything that has to kind of survive in the world, has to interface with the world, has to predict what's going on, and does this whole dynamic that we see correlations between the brain in us, because that's the organ that centralizes this process. So the final thing I'll say on that is that I said there about consciousness emerging, and there are some nuances there, because to get back, to kind of bring this full circle to the contemplative stuff, because of the interdependence I mentioned earlier, it's not so much that we are genuinely separate organisms that are carrying around our own perspectives and we're all isolated and separate. Rather, each of us is like an eye with which the universe sees. We're a way for the universe to know itself. We are kind of relating to the universe, to the rest of the universe. And I think that's why we're conscious. That's where it fits into the picture. And this is why I initially reached out to Max, because I feel like there are some similarities in our perspectives around this. So it really is the cosmos knowing itself through us. It's a bit like how if your eye was convinced that it was genuinely separate from the rest of the body and it was the thing that did the seeing, that would be delusional. It wouldn't be appreciating that actually it takes the brain, the photons coming in, the whole thing is what allows the seeing to see. The eye is very important, but in the same way, we are like an eye for the rest of the universe. And when it comes to those experiences of kind of, you could say cosmic consciousness or expanded consciousness that feels very fundamental, that leads to some people feeling like reality is made of consciousness, there's a distinction I'd like to make there where I mentioned this formless, potent what I think is the kind of the ground of being. And I think some of the disagreement in this space is because consciousness partakes in that formless, potent, grounded, creative principle, source you could call it. A bit like how you can have, if you take all the real numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, going up to infinity, that's an infinite set of numbers. And then you take just the even numbers, that's clearly smaller, right? You've taken a subset of the first ones, but that's also infinite. So this is an interesting thing about infinities. So in the same way, I feel like the first one is like the boundlessness of all of reality, but the boundlessness of my own mind, the kind of unbound, eternal, infinite, in the sense of like non-finite, non-restricted nature of each of our consciousnesses is fully partaking in that, the infinity of existence, in the same way the even numbers are fully kind of part of that infinity of all numbers. So what I think emerges with life is the kind of the knowing or the cognizance or the aware aspect of consciousness, that we have this space of formless potential where everything's happening right now. But in order for the lights to come on, in order for there to be some kind of, okay, like now I'm experiencing pain, or now there's just some illumination, I do think that plays out through the physical in this very simple way of life relating to the rest of the universe. Whereas the first thing is kind of metaphysical place for consciousness as the ground of being. So it really matters what people mean when they say consciousness, if they're pointing to that potent void or if they're pointing to the knowingness. And even though I'm saying that the knowingness, awareness aspect is emergent, it's emergent at a very basic level. It's kind of that reflexivity of the universe knowing itself. So this isn't some picture in which consciousness is some ephemeral late add-on in existence that's kind of not really necessary. This is something where consciousness is really really fundamental to what we are, and where life and consciousness can't be separated. I'll leave it there for now and see if there are any questions. Are we at the 40-minute mark? Is that good for Q&A for the rest of the hour? Or it's probably a good point to, there's a lot more I can say if people want, but I can keep going if people want.
This is on. You had a question, yeah.
Thank you, James, for a really good and very clear talk. I'm just reflecting on what you say about the universe experiencing itself. Is there that implies a sense of evolution, a spiritual evolution going on? Why?
So I would say I'm skeptical of worldviews where there is some story about us going somewhere. This is really building to something important, because I think that's the basic. We mentioned time earlier, and how the sense of self, the ego, really plays out through meaning and seeking some like story, some satisfaction, like some sense of importance. I think this fits again with the kind of the Taoist Buddhist kind of orientation here, where to me, when I feel most clear and in touch with what's really going on, is a sense of freedom beyond meaning, beyond the sense of the eternal here and now. It's always this. It's always just this moment. We're not actually going anywhere. It's like if you see, people make the simulations of, the way that the solar system moves through space and the Earth goes around the sun. If you watch those videos, you just get this impression all of human history is playing out on this little ball, and it's just spinning, 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 and it's like it's all happening now. And it's actually not going anywhere. It's like it's very convincing that we're really going to get somewhere. But I feel like that's a way that the mind flees the present moment. So I'm skeptical of those kinds of views. But there is definitely a kind of complexification happening. I guess my orientation is to think that it's not happening for a reason. The universe doesn't want to wake up. It's not it's not striving to. It's just kind of happening. It's all, as I mentioned, it's all it's a wondrous play beyond meaning, and it's joyous in that way that it's beyond meaning in a liberating way. And that could also be, sincerely what I believe, but also my own personality with my own background, the burdensome weight of the Catholic upbringing of like, no, there is meaning, there are objective rules written in the universe that you need to get right. Like, I really personally enjoy the sense of like, no, it's just free play beyond meaning. Like, but it also feels more accurate to me as well. But
I see the thought of Buddhism, the universe is in a sense, in fact, not necessarily benign, and the best we can do is get ourselves out of it.
So I wouldn't say I mean, again, part of my orientation to the Mahayana Buddhist school is a sense of circularity where you don't transcend, you discover that samsara is nirvana. The sacred is already here. So after my awakening, I remember having this feeling of like, we've always been in the Garden of Eden, but there's just been this kind of ignorance, like we just don't know it. So this is, the spiritual is not somewhere else, it's everything. So the best we can do, which is pretty good, is to relieve our suffering by being here now, by surrendering into this moment. But yeah, I think the absurdism of existence in the sense that an earthquake can just happen and someone can die, and if there's a story, well, actually that's really good because or a disease killing children or whatever, to me there's a sense of that does just seem like things can happen, and there's this absurd, as you said, like universe is just a brute fact. It's just kind of happening. I do think that fits with what I think is true, but I'm adding the personal thing just in case there's some of my own bias from my own personal story creeping in, to be transparent about that I do prefer that for personal reasons, that narrative of
Thank you. Yes, so I was curious, in the light of what you said just a few minutes back, is that most sort of mystical pathways that your reading seems to chime with, in terms of that consciousness is not something that is biologically a progressive thing, but consciousness is effectively expressed in matter, or there are these different layers of consciousness, and matter is one of them. Most mystical traditions have a pathway. They have a kind of set of practices that lead towards an awakening, because awakening is not a natural, necessarily spontaneous process for humans anyway. It seems to be that as we are born and we become conditioned by environmental sets of circumstances, we lose that openness that you talked about very early on. So I'm just wondering how you view these practices.
Yeah. After finishing this book, I really shifted my attention to creating guided practices around for exactly this reason, because I think it's one thing to just have ideas, but where the rubber hits the road is in one's experience. It's an interesting question as to whether it's natural or not, because I do think, in my case, I didn't come to it through practices or through knowing about it even. I didn't have any concept of this stuff, and so it has felt like a very natural process of kind of almost like a kind of existential homeostasis of some surrender into the currents of existence that are bigger than I am. I think I've lost the core of the question at the end there. I think I might have lost the thread now.
Maybe this is the question. Is it a natural
practices, right.
Or do we need these alignment practices to find that particular vision?
The way that I've come up with a kind of developing a synthesis of different traditions. I'm using the phrase open looking for this, and it's very similar to different strains of meditation and also self-inquiry from Advaita Vedanta. But it's the openness is that aspect of surrender, that these insights can't come from you. They can't come from the contracted egoic sense of self that's trying to grasp and intellectually pin stuff down, because that's the thing that surrenders to reveal the wholeness that's already present. So that's the open surrendered quality, which you find in traditions like Zazen, in just sitting, non-meditation. You're not trying to do anything in Zen. But then the looking is a kind of engaged inquiry, so like self-inquiry and Advaita, where you'd say like, who am I? And you're trying to kind of seek for the self that isn't actually there in experience, as a way to kind of rupture the illusion, or Vipassana as well, I think is, the way it's taught in Tibetan Buddhism is from a place of wide open awareness, where you so you have this openness, but you're also deconstructing and interrogating, seeing the impermanence, emptiness, unsatisfactoriness of all apparent phenomena. So I've tried to kind of bring all these together into a very simple experiential orientation of awareness, where it's mainly oriented around the self, because that's the fundamental conceptual division that everything else is scaffolded on. So it's a kind of self-inquiry with different aspects depending on where someone's at on the path. But I think what I've seen, I think, is that the main determinant of how effective this kind of thing is how much motivation there is. Ironically, given that the ego can't be the thing that does it, there can be this kind of whole bodily longing for peace or to come out of suffering. And in my case, it was just immense suffering and the kind of needing to get out of it that drove me forward. And in people I've seen who've gone very deep with this stuff as well, it's usually that. It's usually or even just some kind of intellectual orientation towards absolute thoroughness and need for truth, and some obsessive kind of searching. And you can't really, I think you can kindle that in yourself. You can start to kind of ask, like, why am I interested in this stuff? Is it purely intellectual? Am I trying to impress someone? Like, because if that's the case, you're probably not going to go very far. Or is it coming from, no, it's to do with suffering, or it's to do with a need for truth? I think if one starts there and then one starts to inquire in a very directed way, it actually becomes a very natural process of just releasing this contracted egoic sense of feeling under threat and separate to feeling the inherent kind of boundless openness of awareness that's already present. If you use a kind of painting analogy, this is already a canvas of paint, but we're so taken in by the appearances that we're kind of like, it's like if you looked at the Mona Lisa and you were just really obsessed with, like, okay, well, that's a woman there, and I'm not looking at a painting right now, and someone's like, no, look, the whole thing is just paint. It's all just, there isn't actually a woman there. Like, that's your perceptual system, like imbuing this arrangement of paint with some reality. So that's the kind of shift. But it's a shift. When you move experientially in that direction, it's a state of real openness and vulnerability. And so that can take some adapting to, getting used to. So I think that takes you into kind of the emotion space, which I think I've found is where most people are kind of resistant. What people call shadow work, psychotherapeutic stuff. But yeah, if the willingness is there, you can just keep drilling down until the spaciousness is kind of revealed. So I think in my own journey, I haven't spent loads of hours on a cushion meditating in a traditional way, but I've spent almost every moment of my life obsessively interrogating, mainly because of suffering, of just like, okay, well, how's this suffering showing up? Because after that initial opening, it's one of those things, once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. So I could always puncture the suffering by going into a sense of the absolute, of just everything just is what it is. But it would only last a few seconds and I'd collapse back into suffering. And so there was I knew there was a way to experience that wasn't in the suffering, and I needed to get to it. So from that just led to this obsessive looking. So if you call that a practice, then I think practice can be very powerful. But you need to want it really. If someone just says, here you go, do this practice, it's probably not going to have the effect.
I have no idea if I'm going to be able to articulate this at all.
That sounds like a good question.
Well, not necessarily. So I'm a clinical psychologist, and also I am familiar with some of the things that you talked about. I went to Schumacher College, which I don't know if you're familiar with. So there's lots of conversations about consciousness. And also dabbled, it's fair to say, in a lot of literature about non-duality. And where I left it was a sense of concern. It's really interesting that you talk about suffering, and I can see why. Is there something I need to do differently with the mic? It's not buzzing it, okay. The place I left it is some degree of concern because, personally speaking, I completely agree with what you're saying. For me, the experience of those other states of awareness are this incredible joy and just freedom and like, oh wow, we're all knowing ourselves, wow, oh my God. But what I am wary of is when these conversations become a way of people escaping their lived experience and so I'm not coming in a challenging way, but in a really, and actually personally had an experience where I was struggling once and went to see a Totnes coach who tried to perhaps compassionately make my suffering less by kind of saying, oh, this is all your perception, blah, blah, blah. And actually I think it's incredibly dangerous. And I'm sort of curious about how you bring your work in a way that is enabling the freeing of suffering, but not the escape of real human experience.
Yeah, no, I absolutely love that question. That's really core to I really resonate with everything you said. So I think what I see a lot in kind of contemplative spiritual spaces is maybe understandably a kind of anchoring to the absolute, a sense of, this kind of freedom everything just is, and really kind of trying to escape. There can be just that orientation, because that's kind of what the project is. We all know how to be a self to begin with in terms of showing up in the world with our attachments, and the orientation is away from that. So I think what you say though is that is true, that can lead to an imbalance. And because my initial awakening was very thorough, and then the surrender afterwards was very challenging and very, to integrate it and have it be an abiding thing, was very deconstructive. It felt like a death. It felt like a kind of a lot of letting go and a real shedding. And so my orientation, have I gone quiet? Am I okay? Yeah, I'm okay. My orientation was actually a real strong orientation to the relative. And I was basically, because it's a process of letting go of attachments when you integrate this stuff, it was like going through the stages of grief, and there was a lot of bargaining and a lot of kind of trying to frame this no, I should do like psychotherapy, and I don't want to let go of, and so a lot of trying to take positions. And it turned out to be very helpful because I was very thorough to not fall into the pitfalls you're describing. I never, a silly example would be, I've heard in non-duality meetings, I heard one where someone was like, when my wife gets annoyed at me for not doing the washing up, I say, well, there's no one to do it, so it's fine. And it's like, come on, that's not what this is about. That's, you're using it for something, So as far as I know, I've never kind of shown up in the world in that way, which is the kind of the bypassy. But that's a trivial example, but that could be really negating your own need for trauma healing. That could be like, oh, I don't need to, there is no one here to do the trauma healing. And so I think these conversations are absolutely crucial. What I did discover in myself was when I would try to be like, okay, now I've got a way of being in the conventional reality that I can stay in, I would always inquire, well, where's the attachment here? Is there something that's leading to me doing this? And there was always some wounded kind of part of me that needed love, needed witnessing, compassion. And when I did that, it did lead to spaciousness here, in deepening into the absolute. So again and again, I was like, now I've got a way to anchor into this. Oh, wait a minute, no, if I'm really honest with myself. But it was in a very healing way. It was not in a bypassy or split. It was deep. It was like dying into wholeness, because it's like the self structure actually can only really exist by othering other parts of what it is to be a human. So it could be like, well, I'm actually a very peaceful person, and so all our natural capacity for anger is smushed down. And then when you feel that repressed anger, the identity kind of goes away. So well, now I don't know, is that story right? Is the embodied anger right? What's the truth? And you let go of the idea that there has to be some identity. But that's the kind of healing way in which you become whole enough that you're no longer stuck in needing certain stories to manage that repressed emotion stuff. So I think basically the solution is conversations around this stuff, being really open, honest about it. I have a podcast, I talk ad nauseum with people who I respect about these issues, and I think I want to see more people talking about this stuff. There's also dangerous things around, there's a sentiment that you have to have a strong ego to surrender the ego, and so there can be people who are just very traumatized and have a weak sense of self, and are trying to kind of work with, that's the appeal of this stuff, is almost like a self-bullying, self-negating, I'm worthless, I'm nothing, and that's not what this is about. At that point, you need to do something more healing, psychotherapeutic, to discover something that's more to do with aligning with what's the case, rather than buying into some story. So yeah, I think there's a hugely important rich, because I guess I'm part of I think we go through these cycles where people get in touch with the reality of this stuff, and then it becomes ossified into dogma, into kind of, and the kind of alive core of it dies out. And so then people feel this need to reinvigorate, to rediscover. And I think we're in a phase of that rediscovery now. And especially people like me who don't identify in a particular tradition, because I'm trying to be part of that rediscovery, a pitfall of that is these traditions do have a lot of practices, like just take loving kindness in Buddhism. That's a very common thing, but you get a lot of non-duality people who are just like, oh, you don't need that, but that's there for a reason. That's like nourishing and keeps you from just being like, from drifting off into being decoupled from the rest of reality. So yeah, really, really important points.
Yes, there was a question from Zoom, I think leads on from what you were saying. Could you speak about love and compassion and other qualities of the heart?
Yeah, so the open potency that I described, that I think is the source, the creative principle, you could say that's unconditionality in the sense that it's not, it's not finite, it's not bound, it's not limited, it's just this open expressiveness. In my experience, when I open to love, what I find is, so you open to love, and then you realize, well, the core quality of love is unconditional love. Like, if you have conditions, that's not really love. If you're trying to triangulate and control and coerce, and so you touch into unconditionality. And then what I found is that unconditionality is that potent formlessness. So it makes sense to me if people say reality is made of love. I would be a lot more comfortable if someone saying reality is made of love than saying made of consciousness. But again, love here is something so formless and pristine, and it's like white hot. You can't really say anything about it. But to me, that is the core flavor of love. And so I think the orienting to love is a way that, I gestured earlier to say that I feel like the naturalness of this process is a kind of homeostasis, which means that the system knows how to kind of come into some natural balance with the rhythms of existence. And the way you do that is you open up so the system can start to get feedback and to settle into a new balance. That opening up is what experientially feels like love. So I think that makes it a good signpost to kind of orient to the absolute, to the source, creative principle, whatever you want to call it, in a way that does heal, does bring us into greater wholeness, greater alignment. So this is a view where I think you can make a rigorous philosophical and scientific case for something which sounds a bit like a hallmark sentiment or some nice flow. Wouldn't it be nice to believe reality is made of love? And I think scientists in particular would find that kind of a bit like wishful thinking, some delusional hope. But in my experience and in my thinking about this stuff, it totally makes sense in the way that I was describing it. Describing it there. But also the compassion piece we mentioned as well is because the self, there is just this one reality taking it in through multiple perspectives. And so the compassion for suffering of others is a natural, kind of empathic thing that happens when you let go of the delusion that you are the be-all and end-all. Like, James is the main character of existence, and what happens to him is really important. And sure, like, you've got your lives, but I'm the main character of the show. When you let go of that and you see, sometimes this is called like open individualism, the idea that reality, there aren't actually different selves taking reality. It's all reality looking at itself. When you see that clearly, that does lead to compassion. It's a kind of natural stance as opposed to a kind of distancing, a kind of closing down of the heart where you really are kind of guarded in your fabricated sense of self.
Which takes us to 8:30 precisely. So that is the first hour of this cafe. Thank you, James, for the first hour, and an intriguing subject and intriguing questions and answers. There are many more deep questions, I think, and hopefully deep answers to follow after half-hour break, when we can all have time to discuss with each other and with James if you want. So thanks. Okay, we're going to start again. I want to explore something with you which touches on some of the issues that were asked in the room before, but maybe want to see how you cross the T's and dot the I's a little bit more. So I'm very sympathetic and very much appreciate the way you want to focus on the ground of being and as an experiential aim. But what I want to probe with you a little bit is the question of the reality of the here and now. And the way I hear you is that you're taking a classic Advaita Vedanta position, where the real, the ultimately real, is all that's real. And this in the here and now is all illusion. Right. And that ties in with you wanting to link that to the neuroscience of hallucinations and so on. Now, two things there. One is that that's not the only interpretation of Vedanta philosophy. And another interpretation of Vedanta philosophy, particularly a more recent one, is one that takes this as real as well as that as real. And the reason this is real is because it is an expression of that. And so this is that expressed as a physical world. So that's one question. And the second related issue was the link to the neuroscience, where you talk about this as I know this is the metaphor, the metaphor on the street at the moment, as a hallucination. Well, a much older way of talking about it in psychology is that, yes, this is a construction, but there's still a distinction to be made between a hallucination, old style, and this. And so in a hallucination, old style, is where you see, a lake of water in the desert and there isn't one there. So another way of talking about this is to say, yeah, it's a virtual reality of a kind, but even within virtual reality systems, for instance, in medicine, where surgeons are carrying out very careful operations using a screen, which is, kind of virtual version of what they're dealing with. The actual nature of the virtual reality maps quite closely onto the actuality. So it's a good model. Now, the reason I want to focus on that is because you also talked about predictive processing. And if indeed, and there's good evidence that the brain actually works as a predictive processor, if there's nothing there, what is there to predict? So if your predictions are bad, you get knocked over by a bus. And in a way, what you're kind of getting into is an idealist position, classical idealist position. And one worries about bridges and so on. We were discussing this over lunch. Yeah. If you're an engineer, bridges seem to need to stand up, whether or not anyone's watching it, even when people are asleep. And I personally, if I could just talk about, my own personal experience with these same issues, it's every time that I don't see something that I whack my head against it, and the world reminds me that it doesn't depend for its existence on my perceiving it. So, the contrasting position would be to say, yeah, there's what's ultimately real, and it's a dance, and so on, and this is an expression of the dance. Yeah. But we're in the dance, and we have to learn to dance with the expression of the dance, and that includes the suffering, and that includes the journey, and that includes the possibility of actually a journey of development where one both learns to dance with the here and now, and hopefully in the end also get closer to realizing the kind of ground of the kind that you were talking about. How do you feel about all that? It's a lot to deal with in one question, I know.
So my answer is actually probably going to be very short, which is that I think I basically agree with everything you said. So I think the issue may be, so what I find again and again is that language really, it's not only that it struggles in this area, we typically make the mistake of thinking that we know what words mean, that they have some inherent meaning, and so that can get us into traps where for one person you're trying to emphasize something with a word, and for another person actually they interpret it a different way. So when I say hallucination, for example, I mean exactly as you described, a construct, something generated from within, but the controlled aspect is that it's like an interface. So I completely agree, it's an effective interface. It's not an unconstrained, delusional, mirage, illusion type thing. And so actually, on the first point, I think the two truths teaching of Buddhism to me is perhaps the highest teaching. So I completely agree as well that I'm not negating the relative world that exists as the relative. So you have the absolute, ultimate nature of reality, and then there's this conventional, relational, relative aspect of reality, and they both exist as themselves. So as you mentioned, there can be, if you think of spirituality as like you're playing Monopoly and you forget you're playing a game and you think you're a Monopoly billionaire and you're really invested in this game, and someone tells you, it's just a game, right? It's not as real as you think it is. And then you're really invested in it, but then awakening is like getting up from the table and saying, oh wait, it was a game. And so what some traditions say there is like, well, screw it then, what's the point? This is a kind of transcendent orientation, not two truths. It's kind of like games suck, I'm not interested in it, this is real over here. Whereas I'm saying, well, games can exist as games. The problem isn't that games are games, the problem is that you mistake the game for reality. So in the same way, if you think that relative reality is ultimate reality, that's a problem. You're going to suffer, you're going to be confused, but relative reality does exist as relative reality. And then I think when we get to what I mean by kind of insubstantial or, I find myself kind of very much reacting against the positions that you mentioned of, again, the kind of world negating positions, the idealist positions, because I do think buses exist. Like I do think that there's a thing there that will hit me if I step in front of it. The interesting thing is that that's a relationship, that's part of the dance, and that if you look at the subatomic particles that make up that bus, they are this strange mirage shifting thing where they don't just exist as bricks that are always there. They're not like the bridge in that they don't seem to, or rather the way they show up is because the dancers are always dancing. And so there's something ungraspable that seems strange to our primate minds about the fabric of reality, it seems. But I do think that shakes out to the classical world of physics that operates as we think it does. So I think if you put 3 oranges on a table and I perceive 3 oranges, my interfacing, even though I'm constructing this simulation, this virtual interface, that number 3 seems to correspond to something in reality, and we can all count the oranges, and this is why the objective world is kind of quantitative. It's the stuff that we can all report on, like the length of the table, whereas experience is qualitative, that can't be kind of measured in the same way. So yeah, I think the objective, the quantitative does exist, and that's really the game we're playing here, is trying to, well, how do they relate to each other? What's the difference between this third-person description and first-person? But yeah, it's an issue with language, I think, that when you talk about this stuff, we're talking about quite subtle distinctions here, and the difference between a kind of an empty world that does exist versus an empty world that's just empty and like nothing is a bit subtle. There's a great philosopher of Buddhism called Jay Garfield, who's written a lot about Madhyamaka Buddhist philosophy, and he talks about kind of illusions being something where an illusion is something where its mode of existence and its mode of appearance are different. So if you see a mirage in the desert, it looks like it's some water, but actually the way it exists is as light bouncing around, or a rainbow looks like one way, but it exists in a different way. That's not to say rainbows don't exist. It's just that if you mistake the appearance for the way, if you think the way that a rainbow exists is as a physical arch, you're mistaken, and it's illusory in that sense. If you were then to say, okay, I don't believe in rainbows anymore, rainbows don't exist, that would be a mistake. So in that way, everything's like a rainbow in that we reify and solidify into thinking that things are really solid and real and have their own essence that are independent of us. But the closer we get, the more we find the void-like quality in that as you approach the rainbow, it disappears, but that's because the way it exists is in the interconnection of the humidity, the sunlight, the perspective, so all that's still there, and that's the interdependence. So that's the flip side of emptiness and interdependence. So it's like, I think the closer you get to reality, you find this empty fullness, this balance of being and non-being, where it's like, and this is the kind of the generative void thing I mentioned, where it's like reality is both very full and expressive in this dance, but the more you try and grasp it, you do find it has this void-like empty quality as well. And that makes sense to me intellectually. I can go into that as well if people are interested. I do think you can tell a story as to why that should be the case. I'll save that. If people want me to go into that, I can do that later.
Yeah, questions? No.
Hello? Oh,
Hi.
hi. Is there any meaning in a rainbow?
Yeah, so I think this kind of goes back to the, and you touched on this as well, Max, around progress, that typically, so I think meaning exists through creatures like us that try to make sense of the world in order to survive. So you could say on the ultimate level there's no meaning, on the absolute level things just are what they are, they don't mean anything, but on the relative level existence has this capacity to do meaning making through us. So the rainbow has meaning for the individual looking at it, but the rainbow doesn't even exist without that whole interplay of the person looking at it. Like if every living thing died on Earth, there wouldn't be any more rainbows because the rainbow involves a viewer from a certain perspective. There would still be humidity and light, but there would no longer be any rainbows. I mean, if you say in the whole of the universe, if every living thing died. So in that sense, it can't have meaning in and of itself.
If you experience a rainbow and you have a certain feeling about something from it, where do you then perceive that existing?
So in this view, I think everything that exists as a relationship, a kind of, everything is relationship. And so it's the relationship of the viewer to the humidity, the light, the way our perceptual system is making it appear, one's memories. It really, the beautiful flip side, I mentioned the flip side of emptiness is interdependence, and this really goes through to everything in reality. So there you go from the rainbow and your meaning through to the humidity, the light, but your personal development as a person, your evolutionary history as a human. Everything in the universe is really implicated in anything. If you try and explain anything at all, you end up, if you want to do it thoroughly, you have to explain everything in the universe. This was really beautifully written about by Thich Nhat Hanh, the Buddhist teacher, who gave the example of a flower, where he said that, if you want to explain what a flower is, you need to invoke the existence of the sun to explain the green chlorophyll on the leaves. You need to, the fractal nature of the roots implies the existence of rain clouds, and on and on. And he says, so the flower implies everything in existence. It's full of the whole of existence, and it's empty of one thing, which is essence of flower, essence of something separate from the rest of existence. That's something we imbue with our perceptual systems, that we learn, well, that's a flower, that's a weed. A weed is something that we deem to not want in our gardens. Weeds don't exist objectively, and that's a good example of that meaning making. It requires us to judge and make, categorical decisions about what we like and what we don't like.
We make choices. So you said earlier about being the eye of the universe. So if you see a rainbow, you're the eye of the universe witnessing a rainbow?
Yeah, we're all windows of the universe onto itself, you could say.
So, but you have a certain experience of feeling within that. And I'm just wondering what's the link between that feeling and being the eye of the universe? What is there? Don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to dispute anything you're saying, I'm just trying to explore it a bit. The sense of self being having a feeling which is an eye of the universe, for me, feels like something of meaning on a bigger scale.
Right, okay, yeah, so this is something actually, yeah, what you're pointing to I think is fertile ground, because this goes back to the process idea, and Max was pointing to this too, in the sense of like, I was negating time earlier, but like in a sense our journeys are real for us, then, and if we are manifestations of the universe, then the universe in a sense is having that journey through us. And I know, there are people I respect who take this position that meaning is kind of intrinsic to the universe, or it's part of where it's going, it's some force. To me that's not how it looks. And I mentioned earlier that could be my own bias, that I don't see it that way, but I sincerely believe that's, I can't really give a good answer about what's the difference between the universe, the absolute, not having meaning, and us having it as these parochial little creatures that make our own meaning. That seems to imply some kind of separation, which I don't want to do. So there is some deep continuity there, where the universe is doing this meaning thing. But again, if you zoom out, it seems like a kind of a dusting of meaning where there's life. It's not the main show. The main show seems to be this huge space around all this little dust. We're like little sprinkles of meaning and illumination, it seems. So yeah, it's kind of personal preference, the way you slice that. If you want to say that's the universe, if it's the universe doing it or if it's us doing it, both are true, really. But yeah, that's a great place. That's a place that I would like to have more conversations with people, because it's something where I just have a preference, so I haven't spent that much time wrestling with the other side of things, and I definitely think there's stuff there to, like Whitehead was someone who wrote about this, who's a good example, yeah.
Yes, you can hear me? Good. This is a question from someone on Zoom. What do you think the implications of your perspective are for the polycrisis, in particular the climate, ecological, biodiversity crises, and throwing AI into that as well? That's a great question. It sounds like somebody who's read the book, because those are themes that are in the book that I haven't touched on, really. My interpretation is that the mistaken experience of separation is at the root of the polycrisis, is at the root of suffering, individual and collective. That there's a way that reality is, and a way that we misperceive it, that leads to us operating in this kind of selfish, conflict-based mode, where othering leads us to basically that, Ramana Maharshi, who's an Advaita teacher, was once asked, how should we act towards others? And then his answer was, there are no others, which is the kind of the perspective I'm pointing to. We spoke earlier about compassion. And so when you see non-separation, you show up in the world in a more harmonious way. It's like, there's a great biologist at Tufts University called Michael Levin, and he's doing very cool work in lots of different areas of biology. But he also works in theoretical stuff, and he has this idea of what he calls a cognitive light cone, which is basically how big is your circle of concern. A cancer cell has a very small cognitive light cone. It's just focused on its own immediate survival, which means it can't factor in the fact that its behavior will destroy the organism on which it depends. So it doesn't have a wide enough kind of horizon or big enough cognitive light cone to live in a harmonious way. So I think the cancer analogy is a bit overused, but I do think there's a similar dynamic where when there's sufficient collective trauma or individual trauma, people can show up in the world in a very contracted, defensive way that is ultimately harmful to themselves. And I think this is what happens with the climate crisis. Instead of having a sustainable, I think is it the Iroquois who have this 7 generations principle of like act and factor in 7 generations into the future of any decision you make. And clearly our dominant world culture is not doing that at the moment. And that's a sense of trying to anchor your cognitive light cone to a more harmonious mode of operation. And you can do that just in a selfish way, that you're just like, I don't want to live in a world where there's biodiversity loss and conflict. And so it comes down to wisdom, really. And I think the opposite of wisdom is the reified belief in separation and selfhood. So that's the polycrisis. I think that's why religion's a thing, really, why union, non-duality is this thing we all know instinctively to move towards, that it's necessary. And it's the root of everything we care about, really. And then AI so with AI, it's actually a very good place to be really precise when you're offering a theory of consciousness, because if you're going to be precise, a common way scientists approach this is to say, well, you don't understand something unless you can build it. If you can make it in a machine, then you can show you can really understand how something works. I don't think we can build conscious machines, but in saying why not, I think that unpacks some of my perspective. And effectively, I think all living things are alive because we have to kind of pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. We're not designed by an outside intelligence, so we need to anchor ourselves to the world around us in order to self-organize and create ourselves. Things that we create are not like that. We arrange them and set them running. They're effectively abstractions. They're models of other processes. So AI is a model, it's artificial intelligence, right? Intelligence exists in systems like us that are kind of self-organizing processes in existence. And then you can model that and you can instantiate it in a robot or in a machine, but you're still dealing with an abstraction. So it's a bit like if I wrote the equations that I'm talking about with the predictive processing stuff on a napkin, no one would think that napkin is suddenly conscious, right? I've written down an abstraction about this process. Now, if I make that into transistors switching on and off, nothing has changed. It's still an abstraction. And so AI is just really a kind of abstracted version of this process. If we could coax artificial life into existence, so say you made it out of silicon or something, and you got this thing that's self-organized, I do think that would be conscious because it would be doing the same process that we're doing. But you can't design that and set it running in the way that, I said you would have to coax it into existence, because imagine if you want to build a tornado and you think, okay, well, I'm going to arrange all the air particles in the right way and then I'm going to push them and that's going to be a tornado. That's to misunderstand what a tornado is. Again, because of the interconnection, a tornado exists because there's hot air over here, cold air here, and it's dissipating through this kind of emergent form. We are emergent forms of the energy dissipation of the kind of energy in the core of the Earth initially, with the origins of life, but also the energy that we're being saturated in from the sun. And so we are part of that process. You can't, it's part of I mentioned at the beginning, separation as a delusion, the idea that we are objects, that this body is an object that is separate to all the other processes, that this body is a continuation of the movement of oxygen, the movement of carbon through this biosphere. There isn't a separation. So in the same way, to create a conscious synthetic system, you would have to recreate those conditions and coax it into existence. You can't have a machine that's an object and have it engage in the world in the way that I'm describing that would be conscious. Right.
So, the discussion, it seems to me, I'm interested to know where you stand on this, the discussion about whether the ultimate is real or not.
Yeah.
In Buddhist terms, doesn't have to be right because it's not those things.
Yeah.
The other question I was going to raise is asking where you stand in the Western tradition. There's been, since the 19th century, a major development in process relational thinking, starting with Bergson, Whitehead, Deleuze, and even some will be surprised with Heidegger, later Heidegger in particular. It's a non-substantialist, and the whole of his life in his study of being has been anti-substantialism, if you will. And he's come up with a position in the end, which is not too dissimilar from a Buddhist Taoism. So that's the kind of context. I wonder how you would relate to that.
Yeah. So the first question, I'm surprised I haven't used the term non-conceptual yet, because that's the term that I have typically used for reality. It's not, we mustn't mistake our concepts for reality itself. And I'm using the word reality there, but reality is one of those concepts. So I 100% agree that reality, what is, or even what is and what isn't, or this is the best way to say it, gesturing to what's happening right now. This is neither real nor unreal. I 100% agree with that statement. And that kind of fits as well with the empty fullness, the being and non-being. But to really accept that, there needs to be quite a deep letting go, typically. That's why we're not just talking about ideas here, we're talking about a very embodied, contemplative kind of orientation to reality, because concepts allow us to create some sense of distance and control and separation. So surrendering into the non-conceptual can be quite, a challenge in that way. So yeah, I entirely agree. And when it comes to the lineage of process relational thinkers, actually me and Max were talking about, we share this orientation with how we developed our respective positions, which was a kind of going through an intentional period of not reading other thinkers and trying to think through from one's own commitments what must be the case for my system to cohere. And I remember as I was doing that, I was a bit self-conscious as I was doing it. I was like, I don't feel very scholarly. I should probably do more like reading. But every time I would do it, I would get this feeling of like, I can feel there's a bunch of assumptions here, like a lot of assumptions that are kind of, if I keep reading this, there are too many to keep track of and identify. I'm just gonna, especially with contemporary neuroscience, where I could just feel this is gonna pull me away from the life-centric view just through, a kind of basic human empathy thing. So I only really started reading those writers and using the term process relational after I'd already kind of unpacked my view. And Bergson in particular is, basically there's, Bergson and Whitehead are the main of the people you mentioned who I've read, and their systems are so complex and detailed that I ended up reading enough to kind of, to feel that we were in a similar ballpark, but then I'm not I'm a trained neuroscience, I'm not pretending to be an academic philosopher in that sense, so I pretty much just left them there when it comes to that. So I'll let other scholars I'm connected with some, especially Whitehead scholars, quite a few, so I'm going to have conversations with them soon, so I'll let them tell me where the major differences are really and in how I fit into that lineage, basically.
And that actually takes us to 9:30. So, fascinating discussion, fascinating topic, fascinating talk. Thank you, James, and thank you all for participating in Consciousness Cafe. I think another hand for James is absolutely required.
Thank you. Thanks.
And I wish you all good night. So Consciousness Cafe is now officially closed.
Thank you.